Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this series may contain images, voices, or names of deceased persons.
Welcome to Susan Carland in Conversation. This interview is a supplement to episode 7 in the Australian Journey series, The Stolen Generations.
Today I'm meeting with Professor Peter Reid. For nearly 30 years, Peter worked at the Australian National University, lecturing in Australian and Aboriginal history. Peter's groundbreaking work there on the removal of Aboriginal children from their families helped instigate the Bringing Them Home inquiry. In 1980, Peter became the co-founder of Link Up, a collective run by and for members of the Stolen Generation. And to this day, Link Up reunites families torn apart by past government policies. Peter, we're here on this beautiful Melbourne day. Just over there is Federation Square, where Kevin Rudd's apology to the Stolen Generations was broadcast to hundreds of people. And we're sitting here on the banks of the Yarra River, which I imagine would be a body of water that would have been quite significant to local Aboriginal people. Would that be correct?
Well, Susan, rivers are always important as Aboriginal traffic ways. Now this is, of course, Wurundjeri and the Bunurong, one of their principal boundaries, but always traffic going up and down for trading purposes, ceremonies, socialising. Travelling on rivers is an easy way to get around compared to walking. So in the Federation Square, as you say, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people watching those enormous screens. Now, I was lucky enough to be in Canberra at the time. I was in the Great Hall, in which the most moving thing of the apology was actually people who held up photographs of their parents. Mr. Rudd apologised to them because they never knew what happened to us. We died without ever seeing him again. People in tears, obviously, but tears for what their parents had lost as well as themselves. So that's a moving occasion. But of course, after that, everyone out on the lawns outside Parliament House, what a brilliant day that was. I've never seen such happy people, you know. Some were still looking for their relatives at that time, of course they were. And there would have been people in the audience here who'd been removed, and there were people there and mums who'd never seen their kids again, and there would have been people there, Aboriginal people, who didn't know who they were, or looking for their relatives. We're a pretty composite bunch, and nothing, we can't say everything's been resolved. But it was a good step forward, and was particularly after the actual apology, my goodness, what a happy occasion that was.
The apology was obviously a watershed moment, but I want to take you back a step first and ask you about the term Stolen Generations, which you coined, didn't you?
That's right, in about 1980, yeah. For an article that I've been asked to write by a government agency, and to be historically accurate, I wrote it all day, and I called it The Lost Generations. My wife, sitting on top of the other side of the table, was writing something else, and we swapped articles at the end of the day, and she said, well, those bloody kids were stolen. Yeah, you're right.
They weren't lost.
No, I called it the Lost Generation. Yeah. She said, no, actually it's the Stolen Generations. Yeah. Why don't you call it that? Yeah, so I take the credit, but thank you, Jay Arthur of the National Museum. She was responsible for half the wording.
And I noticed that you used the plural, Stolen Generations. Tell us about that.
The Stolen Generation was a term beloved by the federal government at the time of the Bring Home report. Why they chose that, except to try and conceal the infamy, I don't know, because of course there's been generations of children being removed since, at the very least, Governor Macquarie's native institution in 1814 in Parramatta, perhaps a little bit earlier in Tasmania as well. Every generation suffered until at least 1970, a large number of children being removed.
So that's a long time, that's 150 odd years. Did the Stolen Generations change over time, or in different circumstances?
Well, there always were different motivations. That's the interesting thing. See, back in Governor Macquarie's time, part of the motivation was to prove that Aboriginal children were educatable, not just at the level of whites were educatable at all, but also was well intentioned, realising that the part Aboriginal children who formed half that native institution were never likely to marry white people. Therefore, the best destiny they could have was to place them in a home in which they be part Aboriginal girls and boys, and they're married together. Which didn't really actually happen, but it was kind of well intentioned. So that was one kind of motivation. Another one was saving the children. That is, they're in bad surroundings, they're not being looked after properly. Another reason was that we're going to be swamped by what was called a wild race of half-castes. That was a popular argument from about 1880 to about 1930. And of course, the most common argument till 1950 was these children are a positive menace to the state. If we remain here, if they remain with their parents, living on the Aboriginal reserves, they're going to grow up uneducated, not participating in Australian society, and generally people we don't want. So sometimes homes are in vogue, sometimes adoptions and fostering is in vogue. It gets, the latter two get more important as governments try and save money, because if they're in homes, you've got to pay for the homes. And churches don't want to do it after a while. Therefore, if you can get children adopted, it's free. It doesn't cost anything once they're adopted. In foster homes, well, you have to pay the foster children the foster parents a little bit, but that's pretty cheap too compared to running homes. So that's how the policy is changing.
I want to read you a extract from A.O. Neville's submission on assimilationist policies. He said, "Are we going to have a population of 1 million blacks in the Commonwealth, or are we going to merge them into our white community and eventually forget that there were any Aborigines in Australia?" Was it a genocide?
Well, I wouldn't call it that exactly, because genocide literally means killing people. But you can certainly say it's an ethnocide, or if you like, what you could call cultural cleansing. So the effects on the people concerned in the end will be the same, except of course they'll be still alive. But the idea is that you won't have any people identifying as Aboriginal, nor looking like Aboriginal, nor culturally identifying as Aboriginal in any way at all. That's the end point. And what he's saying there, well, is touching a well-known panic button on the part of the whites. You hear it first in the southern states. In 1880, we got a wild uprising of half-castes. We've got to do something about it. Mr. Gribble, the missionary, used to say that very conveniently. It means, well, why don't you pay for children to be sent to my mission station or to Cumbria. It was all in vogue in the 1930s from Mr. Neville, and also from the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory, because they had so few white people, they could say, we're going to be swamped by these half-castes, as they were called. So it's a well-known pressure point for governments. Panic them into saying, oh, we better have some more money for homes or set up these things. Neville probably believed it, but he also knew perfectly well that you could hit governments with this kind of argument who were short of money and maybe get some results.
These kind of policies must have had a huge impact on the Aboriginal people affected by it. What sort of trauma did they experience?
Well, you've got the trauma of the kids themselves and the trauma of the communities, particularly their parents. Let's talk about the kids first. In Victoria in particular, you've got, you don't have the big homes like you get in some other states. You've got a lot of little homes, private individuals, perhaps with six foster children living there. And when I worked for Link Up, I actually visited a few of them, trying to find out details. But we tend to think that's where they were, but we've got to remember too that, as was revealed in the Australian National Museum's exhibition Inside about the kids in institutions, we realise now that we tend to think of them as non-Aboriginal children, but look at the photographs of children in there and you realise how many Aboriginal kids there actually were in those homes as well, even though they weren't specifically designated Aboriginal homes. So there's a lot of kids there too. Some are sent to a place called the Depot. I'm thinking of New South Wales more here, where if you get through the first night without being raped, you're doing well. Literally, I'm not joking. It had a terrible reputation. After a week or two at the Depot, a matron would introduce you to a succession of ladies, well, analogous to slave owners in a sense, who'd look at you and say, do I want this child to raise as a foster child? Often it's enough to be a bit of a scullery maid, actually, even though she'd go to school. And you had to go through this parade, and you might go to meet 3 people in a week, and none of them wanted you, so you'd stay where you were, and you'd stay there until somebody actually wanted you and take you away. Now let's look at it from the parents' point of view. Now, those of us who are parents themselves can just imagine this little scene. I'm not going to draw an example from, say, Mr. Neville, the film Mr. Neville, where the welfare come on to the mission station, grab the kids and drive off again. No, we're talking about private house. Even in the 1950s, You could go to a suburban school and live in a suburban house, and one day you didn't come home. So just imagine a parent waiting for the kids to come home. Come 3 o'clock, I'll be home in 5 minutes, 10 past. It's fine, you'll be home by now, half past. What's happened to them? The 2 kids, both but not here, haven't come home. Ring up the friends. You've gone to a friend's house? No? So eventually ring up one of the staff. Oh yeah, well actually a policeman came round and took the kids at lunchtime, at 2:30. Where do they go? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? Well, actually, says the teacher, I actually don't know where they take children, where this happens. We know now what happened. Just imagine that. You're waiting for your kids, maybe 3, 5, 7 years old, maybe 12. You may not ever see them again. You may not ever see them again. Mostly they did, but as time went on, in the 1950s they did, but people in the 19th century, no, they just disappear forever. And you can just begin to imagine the heartache, the anguish. You can't comprehend it really. It's a little bit like Admiral Keitel in World War II introduced this terrible policy in the Nazis called night and fog. Now that was designed to terrify people. Instead of kicking in the door, you just remove them quietly and nobody ever knows what happened to them. And that's not the intention here, but the effect is really the same. You just simply cannot find out where your children have gone the day they disappear, and if you do find out they've gone to the depot, well, they're not going to let you in. They won't even admit the child's there necessarily. It's just in this agony of ignorance for years and years, in which you remember them on their birthdays, cry yourself to sleep every night, crying into the pillow. And that's an agonising thing, which only particularly those of us who are parents or grandparents can appreciate.
This kind of trauma must have had a significant impact on erasing culture and identity for Aboriginal people. How did they resist against this and still maintain some of their cultural identity? With
difficulty. But it's interesting, you know, that the opposition in the 1930s was really directed at losing land. You know, reserves are being rolled up all over the place, all through Australia, particularly the southern states. So most of the political process is actually directed at that. In the 1950s and 1960s, the political process is mainly directed towards citizens' rights. So it's not until really the 1970s and 80s that the issue of child removal becomes central. Why is that? Partly it's not so much a collective thing, it's only certain people who have lost their children, but partly because there's so much shame attached to it. The children grew up thinking my parents didn't want me, drunk, mother died, no food, something like that. And they might have really bad memories of what their home life was like before they went, which means that the children and the parents felt a tremendous amount of shame, and you wouldn't necessarily want to stand up and shout, as you did with the land protests, my children have been removed, because it seemed to reflect upon you. Why couldn't you have enough food to feed your children? And so it never became this central point until really the 1970s, partly when Link-Up was getting going to sort of focus these attentions. Everyone has their own private hurts which they carry to this day, both parents and children, but in a sense, even those who had lovely adoptions, and some did, not very many, but some who had lovely adoptions, can still say, well, I still think about what I lost.
There's a memorial in Canberra called Reconciliation Place that has panels devoted to people who were affected by the stolen generations. And I want to read you a quote from one of those people now. It says, "We, the removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children of Australia, would urge you to look through our eyes and walk in our footsteps, to be able to understand our pain. We call on all Australians to acknowledge the truth of our history, to enable us to move forward together on our journey of healing, because it is the only truth that will set us free." Did all Australians acknowledge this truth?
Good question. And I know that quite well. I know the memorial well. Better than most. Thanks to the national apology, thanks to bringing them home. I think it's entered the national consciousness now in a way that violence on the frontier has not, and the way that other parts of the separation policy have not. As I said, you've got two parts of the separation policy: kids who were removed, and that's part of the school curriculum now. We're talking about it now. It's pretty central to Australian knowledge. There are people who say it's wrong, but you know, we don't need to worry about them. Well, the reserve busting policy, driving people from their homes, contrary to half a dozen UN resolutions, incidentally, illegally, ending their living spaces, driving them into the community, that's another enormous blot on our Australian civilisation, the way Aboriginal people were treated. That's never entered the national consciousness. There aren't even memorials to it. And that's, I think it's a real shame. But the child removal policy, yes, it has. It has entered our consciousness, and there is an acknowledgement of the truth.
With the big apology that the government eventually made, there was a lot of tension around that politically. Was there resistance from government because the Australian people just weren't supportive of the apology, or was it something else?
It took a long time for it to sink in. The coalition government were never very keen on it. And there were some voices raised, I believe, in the Labor Party as well. It had to enter the public consciousness. That took a long time. And this will surprise you too, but it took a long time to enter the Aboriginal consciousness. When Umra and I were looking for funds for Link Up in about 1982, we went to a meeting of the National Aboriginal Conference. That was the big representative body from Aboriginal people all over Australia. I still remember it so well. A room full of about 40 or 50 people, right at the end of the week, people fiddling with their phones, checking with their travel vouchers, all that sort of stuff. And Umra was invited to speak. And she spoke about, I was a removed person. And you ought to give us money to help our organisation. People, all Aboriginal people in the room, pens down, look up. What'd she say then? Removed what? Listening. That was a really signal moment in Australian Aboriginal history to me, because at the end of it we're saying, Jesus, was that why we were removed? Was that my auntie never acknowledged who she was? You mean there was actual government policy to remove children like this in the name of assimilation? We didn't quite realise this. This is 1982 or 3, in which Aboriginal people are at last coming on board now. It seems hard to believe now because it's so long ago and because it's so widely accepted. That is, everyone knew their kids had been taken, of course they had, but there was so much shame attached to it, and people who had been removed could live next door to each other for 15 years and never once either side would admit, I was removed from my parents, because they were so ashamed of what it might signify about their own family. And I think that's what's happening here. Now, so once Aboriginal people had accepted it, and it didn't happen overnight, then you had to convince the bureaucracy that there was a case to answer. And, oh God, we had some trouble there too in persuading people that we needed an organisation to reunite people, not just to find out who they were, which wasn't too easy, but I was the historian in that outfit, so I knew where to find the records, but also to introduce them back to their families, reassure the families the reason they hadn't come back all these years was not because they didn't want to, but because they really were too ashamed or didn't want to, or they didn't know where to come back to. And on the children's side, reassuring them that when you come back, you won't be asked to dance a corroboree, you won't be find yourself pregnant, broke or barefoot in 2 weeks, which is what the homes had tended to maintain, that's what would happen to you. Tremendous amount of fear on both sides. It took a long time for white people to comprehend that there was a case to answer, in the same way, in a sense, although it does sound strange, that Aboriginal people took a long time to comprehend the generality of the policy.
So in some ways it was like their minds and their histories had been colonised as well.
Absolutely it has, that's right, yes indeed, yeah.
You mentioned the project that you've been involved in called Link Up. Tell us about that.
Well, that's, its full name is Link Up New South Wales Aboriginal Corporation, and it began when Umra Edwards, in about 1979. She's a member from New South Wales language group, the Gummalroy people. And she'd been through the Cootamundra home, and we got to talk, and eventually, to cut a long story short, she asked me to go home to Tingha with her. We reunited her with her family. She'd had several other brothers and sisters removed, at the end of which she said, let's start an organisation which will help other people to get home from their families. We had the kind of difficulties I mentioned to you about doing that. But eventually we worked out there were a number of things to do. Get people home, find out who they were, get people home, reassure them that Aboriginality was something to be proud of, because not everybody would even admit they were Aboriginal because they were so ashamed of it, and in the best way we can set up an organisation which will allow people to meet others who are like them to share those experiences, bearing in mind that nobody who is removed ever comes back in the same way as if they had never been removed in the first place. People hope to, but they don't. And so that organisation has now been going since 1980, and it's going very strongly. There's a large staff there, all Aboriginal people, and many thousands of reunions have been done. We had a moral first in Alice Springs, then the other states took it up, including the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency. It's not always done by a link-up organisation, but it's doing the same kind of work. Imitations in Canada, in places where Indigenous children have been removed. So it's now a big bureaucracy. It needs a lot of federal funding, and so long as it's getting people home and happy in their heads, well, it'll continue.
Aboriginal people have been telling their own stories about their experiences with the stolen generation, and we can find some of those represented in the First Peoples galleries at Museum Victoria. But you yourself have been archiving some of these stories for about 30 years. Tell us about that process.
There's several collections around. The National Library of Australia made a big collection as part of the settlement from bringing them home. But the thing that I was involved in personally was a film called Link Up Diary, which is available now from the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies in Canberra, and that followed us around for a week, Umra and I and another person, another member of staff, and we worked through all the things we had to do. There's actually a reunion of a father and daughter who hadn't seen each other since the day that she was removed. And it really describes what the complexity of life. You know, it's a very, very complex thing, reuniting and finding who you are and becoming an Aboriginal person again if you want to, or just meeting it. You know, it's immensely complicated. And this movie, which I recommend, gives an indication of what that process is like.
We started this episode with the gate from the boys' home. What does this gate represent?
That's very interesting. It's half the gate, the complete gate, which stood outside the Kincheloe Aboriginal Boys' Home, or Training Home, I think it was actually called. And this half of the gate just says Boys' Home. And it was, I think somebody tried to throw it into the river, but they didn't succeed. It was lying on the edge of the river. And it's been known about for a long time, but with the help of the National Museum of Australia, a number of Kincheloe lads, including Uncle Willie Leslie and Uncle Seth Bowden, went up to Kincheloe, which is a pretty difficult thing to do. Some of them hadn't been there since the day they left, highly traumatised, to try and track down the gate, which they found, and persuaded the person who'd found it, who's an Aboriginal chap, but he hadn't been in the homes himself, but he was very sympathetic, to take it back to the National Museum where it's being exhibited now. Tremendous symbolic importance because most of Kincheloe is gone now. All there is left is something you can't take, which is an enormous tree where the boys used to go and hang out and talk about the experience they had during the day, and just there was their only private place. But this symbolically represents, like all the icons that are kept in the National Museum, it's got such an enormous symbolic importance that this was the place where we lost our childhood. Uncle Seth still says, look, I've been in Pentridge, I've been in Long Bay, nothing as bad as Kincheloe, the Kincheloe Boys' Home.
Peter, thank you so much for your time today. It has been so enlightening and informative, and we're so grateful for the work that you've done in this area.
Oh, thank you, Susan. It's been a privilege talking to you.